Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. As the conflict in Ukraine enters its third month, the West is leading the offensive on the cultural front. Institutions rush to distance themselves from Russian scholars, while operas in the rest of Europe have banned Russian performers and composers. Now, the Cannes Film Festival in France have also said that the official Russian delegation was not welcome. How does the art world react to this new type of cancel culture? Is culture another battlefield, less bloody perhaps, but more pervasive? Earlier on, I talked to Vittorio Sgarbi, art critic and former undersecretary at the Ministry of Culture in Italy.
Sir, welcome to the Hub on CGTN. First of all, I want to ask you about this cancel culture on Russia. We saw the scale of sanctions conducted by the West against Russia has in fact expanded into culture and sports. For example, one of the most famous Russian conductors in the world, Valery Gergiev, was fired from the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra for not denouncing Vladimir Putin. What do you think about the decision?
È un errore grave perché la cultura unisce e non divide.
It's really a big mistake because culture should unite people, not split them up. Do you remember Greece under the colonels? People were not allowed to read Plato and Aristotle. Therefore, the idea of limiting the spread of Russian culture is just a kind of cultural arrogance. It is understandable on a personal level, as one musician may not want to play Tchaikovsky. It's a personal choice. An institution, a mayor, or a minister cannot decide whether Russian music can be played by musicians or whether Russian literature be mentioned by critics or writers, just because Russia attacked Ukraine. A case in point is the ban on Dostoevsky at a university in Milan. War and culture are two totally different things. Culture is universal. Pirandello, for example, was a great playwright. Though he joined the fascist party, his work was widely read even after Italy became a democracy. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Therefore, there's no connection between one's literary achievements and political choices. These are two different things. If a person says, I don't want to play Russian music, or I don't want to read Russian literature, I can understand it. But institutions should not be governed by politics, even if it is to protect victims. It doesn't make sense. There's no logic. It is not reasonable at all.
Non ha nessun significato, non c'è nessuna logica, è impossibile perfino pensarlo.
But sir, do you think arts and the artists can be completely separated from the world of politics?
Beh, diciamo, è difficile fare un ragionamento sulla responsabilità individuale di un intellettuale. In questo caso il direttore d'orchestra come
I don't think we should force intellectuals to take a position for or against the government. Like in the case of Valery Gergiev, the famous conductor. He may be Putin's friend or have a positive view of Putin, like many Russians do. But interpreting Tchaikovsky or Beethoven has nothing to do with one's political leanings. Does famous Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges not deserve the Nobel Prize simply because of his relationship with Pinochet? I think political choices have nothing to do with one's artistic achievements. The idea that someone cannot play Beethoven or Tchaikovsky because of their close relationship with Putin is unreasonable. In our world, we have a lot of Brecht, a great communist playwright who worked in the West for his whole life. Ideology does not hamper one's creation. This is a very stupid idea. If the ordinary people in Ukraine don't want to listen to Russian performers, I think I can understand it. But it is not right for the state to ban a country's culture, because no matter what your ideology is, be it fascism, communism, or supporting Putin, it has nothing to do with art. I can understand it at the personal level, but if it rises to national level, I think it's wrong, even absurd.
Paolo Nolli, an Italian professor, earlier stated that the University of Milan Boccaccia postponed its course on Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, citing the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. He said that in Italy, not only the living Russians are guilty, but also the dead ones. Is this outright racism?
This is outrageous. Paolo Nori was right to quit the University of Boccaccia. For a university not to let its professor talk about Dostoevsky's literary work is a repressive measure, like that of a violent military regime. Both are repressive, and though the degree is different, the intent is the same. Dostoevsky lived way before Putin's time. Banning his work today is tantamount to equating him with Putin's ideas, Putin's political ideas. How is that possible? How can we link Putin's ideas and policies with Dostoevsky? That's outrageous. For example, shall we be banned to read Ariosto just because there was fascism in Italy? It doesn't make any sense. Therefore, when the president of the university said that Paolo Nori could not teach Dostoevsky's work, it was a cultural crime, worse than censorship during fascism.
The artists and curator behind the Russian pavilion and the Ukrainian pavilion have both withdrawn from the Venice Biennale. How big a loss would it be?
Nel caso della chiusura del padiglione russo c'è evidentemente una posizione politica che io non condivido.
Banning Russia from the Venice Biennale is obviously the result of political considerations, and I don't quite agree with this approach. The Biennale is a stage for all the culture in the world. This move is like a sanction imposed by the United States and Europe on Putin. But this is wrong, because art is often used to criticize governments. It is unreasonable to prohibit artists from participating in the Venice Biennale, even though I can understand it. The absence of Ukraine is primarily due to the war. They are occupied by Russia and cannot participate in the exhibition. These are two different situations. The absence of Ukraine is also a statement of solidarity with the Ukrainians, but banning Russia from participating is more a political statement, like sanctions against Russia by the United Nations, the United States, and Europe. But they are imposing sanctions on Russian culture, which is wrong. Ukraine's absence is more due to force majeure. Ukrainians are not in the mood or able to participate in the Biennale. Maybe we can help them make art creations reflecting their experience and participate in the Biennale symbolically. By the way, I'm at the Biennale now.
Io tra l'altro sono alla Biennale adesso.
But some say, this kind of cultural sanctions against Russia will help change the calculation of President Vladimir Putin. Do you think this is the case? Do you think cultural sanctions against Russia will somehow have any impact on the situation in the battlefield?
Non c'è nessun rapporto. Putin non ha
Banning Russian culture has nothing to do with the war. Putin may not care about Venice Biennale at all. He may not know about the event at all. He doesn't pay any attention to the Biennale. And he won't stop the war because Russia is banned from the Biennale. Russians are being punished. This behavior is a punishment on Russian culture, not on Putin. We can impose sanctions on Putin. However, sanctions cannot be imposed on culture. They have no impact on Putin's military action. It's only a symbolic move. Russians are punished, and it does not help prevent Putin's actions in this war.
Per cui non vedo nessuna relazione fra la censura alla Biennale e la volontà di Putin rispetto a questa guerra.
Finally, I want to ask you about Russophobia. I mean, this is not the first time or day one since we've come to see Russophobia or Russophobia in the Western world, right?
La russofobia è una posizione che è inaccettabile sul piano non solo culturale ma anche politico, perché significa
I hope that Russophobia will soon be over. Russophobia is not acceptable both at the cultural level and at the political level. Russian culture is a vital part of the world culture. Russia has Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Mayakovsky, and a lot of prominent writers and artists. They mean a lot to the world. They have nothing to do with Putin's political actions or his military operations. Once Gergiev was asked to conduct, but he decided to turn it down. He himself turned it down. The reason was the current anti-Russian attitude and sanctions on Russian culture. I believe that time will restore dignity to the Russian world and prevent meaningless sanctions. All sanctions are wrong. I agree with the Chinese government on this point. Sanctions on culture are even worse. It is a crime against civilization.
Le sanzioni alla cultura sono un orrore contro la civiltà.
Now, that was my interview with Vittorio Sgarbi. I also talked to some other guests about the same topic. Let's see what they have to say after the short break. You're watching The Hub. So what is behind this growing anti-Russia sentiment in the West? Who is pulling the strings? Are we seeing a new witch hunt reminiscent of 1950s America? To answer some of these questions, let me bring our panelists today. From Stockholm, Sweden, we have Lee Kemp. He's a comedian and former host of Redacted Tonight on RT America. In Shanghai, China, we have Josef Mahoney, professor of politics at East China Normal University. And here in Beijing, China, we have Neil Zhang, curator at UCCA Center for Contemporary Art. Welcome, gentlemen. Lee, why don't I go to you first? I mean, Russia has been celebrated for its world-renowned writers and composers, and now we see a situation where the Western institutions, in the wake-up of this war in Ukraine, has been, performing or exercising their cancel culture on Russia. What do you make of that?
Oh, I personally think it's insane. I mean, my own show, Redacted Tonight, was canceled by U.S. sanctions, but then all the back videos, 8 years of videos, banned on YouTube globally. And that's just my stuff. But you see athletes being stopped from entering competitions, et cetera. And I think it's the worst kind of toxic nationalism. It's acting like human beings are not human beings, but instead just representatives of their country. And that is it. That is all, as if every Russian is Putin and every American is Joe Biden or Donald Trump. To me, it is the worst kind of discrimination. I mean, it's no different than a form of racism. And we've seen it in various conflicts in the past. In World War I, everything that had the word German in it was changed to liberty, liberty burgers and liberty measles and everything. And in the lead up to the Iraq War, because the French, we didn't like that the French weren't going along with us, we changed the French fries to liberty fries. It's just a level of ignorance that is appalling.
Propaganda at its best, right? We know which country does more propaganda than most other countries in this world. Joseph, let me turn to you. I mean, what do you make of the fact that the so-called culturally advanced Western world now suddenly canceling Chekhov and Dostoevsky and ruling out the nutcrackers?
I agree in part with Lee, but I would say there are 4 ways to understand this phenomenon. And first, as he noted, we've seen this before. You can go back to previous conflicts, for example, World War I and II, where you see countries purging themselves of all possible references to an enemy as a type of social and cultural discipline. We did see a street in London that was named German, that was respelled Jermyn during one of the wars. So we live in an age, secondly, where everyone is sensitive to soft power. Consequently, anything that's perceived as showing strength or even humanity from the other side is resisted. Third, we live in a polarized age in which so-called cancel culture, which you mentioned previously, prevails, where many are sensitive to potential triggers that can invite a viral media backlash. So producers, financiers, and so on, they try to avoid this whenever possible. And fourth, we also live in an age of advanced commercial competition. There are other stars, other cultural products, other intellectual properties that exploit these conflicts that are more than happy to push aside their Russian competition.
Neil Zhang, let me turn to you. You're an artist, you're a curator at one of China's largest contemporary art museums, art centers. How do you feel about the fact that less and less people in the West are able to access Russian culture?
I can see today, there's lots of contemporary global events like Venice Biennale happening and the Russian Pavilion was closed. I do agree with what Lee just said, but I think there's another aspect is having those type of global international art events is also, it's not only just the willingness of the country to be part of it, but also there's lots of like flights, shipping, everything we have to consider as part of it, and just simply I think realistically speaking, I think Russians, they have difficulty to be part of this event. So it's not people canceling them, is I think at some aspect is just a realistic decision. They cannot be part of it.
Right. Lee, let me turn to you. I mean, whose loss is it when the West or the Western governments are canceling or practicing this cancel culture on Russia?
Sophisticated humanity, I guess, would be the greatest loss. I mean, yes, it is a great loss to cancel so many, or at least even if they're not canceled forever, but just to stop using or reading certain books is, of course, it's a loss to those who would have been reading them. Wimbledon loses out by not having some of the greatest athletes in the world at their event, but to me, it's just it represents a kind of ignorance that, and it's by design in terms of those that are leading the charge, but in terms of other people following along, it is ignorance to act like that a Russian tennis player has anything to do with the war in Ukraine. And to have them, not allowed to compete in a tennis tournament, just as one example, is just, to me, it's just straight up racism. I mean, it doesn't serve any purpose. It's not going to stop the war in Ukraine. It's not going to change those events. And it really is just, it's wrong-headed. But then on top of that, how many events has America been canceled from because of our bombing of Iraq, or our bombing of Afghanistan, or Libya, or Syria, or the genocide in Yemen? How many times has Wimbledon said, "Oh yeah, nobody in the United States could perform in this athletic competition"? It's only because of American hegemony. It's only America's enemies that actually get canceled from these competitions. So it's not even done universally.
Joseph, do you agree?
I do largely agree. I think there is obviously a pernicious double standard. That's usually what goes hand in hand with hegemony, and so that's nothing new. But I think the broader concern, of course, is that this is part of a broader decoupling, a part of or it could certainly feed this. It's returning to Cold War tactics, dividing the world into us versus them. And we all know that this is dehumanizing, and that it increases the potential for expanding conflict in ways that not only have immediate dangers, but speak to larger concerns that we have globally, such as the need to cooperate on things like the pandemic and climate change.
Lee, let me turn back to you. I mean, we're fellow journalists, and we've seen this double standards, all too often in the Western world. I was in Washington for 8 years, actually 3 blocks from RT America. I was a commentator there occasionally. How do you feel when you see your shows, being taken down by YouTube in a country where freedom of expression was valued?
Well, it's not surprising, I guess, at the end of the day, but it's still, yet I still found it shocking. I mean, I I am sure I do some journalism, but I'm really a comedian journalist. You know, my focus in my show Redacted Tonight was, and my stuff continues to be, comedy. But simply for being truly anti-war and being anti-imperialist and being, anti-corporate greed, I am now one of the most censored comedians in America. And to me, that's shocking. It's shocking that you can't really be a voice for true peace and cooperation and sustainability in this world. And in the United States, that will get you canceled on many big tech platforms. It'll get you maligned by mainstream media. There are attack pieces done on me regularly by the mainstream media, including the largest outlets like the New York Times. And truly, it's for being anti-war and anti-imperialist. And I ended up at RT America for 8 years simply because it was the only channel that was a national news channel that allowed me to do that allowed me to be uncensored and be anti-war and be anti-imperialist. And that's why I was there. It's why many people were there. So to see a comedian become so aggressively censored, again, all my past videos for 8 years banned globally, it truly is still shocking, even though I understand that the United States for many years and maybe forever has not truly been for freedom of press and freedom of speech. They're for freedom of speech when it's not threatening to their systems. And this, again, is nothing new. I know I mentioned that earlier, but the comedians in the past, Lenny Bruce was essentially a very famous comedian, but was essentially driven to his death because he was arrested every time he tried to perform for mocking religion or for going after the U.S. state. And he was arrested for his words. And that was in the, years ago, decades ago. So again, in certain ways, this is nothing new, but the idea that America is truly freedom of speech, truly represents freedom of speech 100% is not reality.
Joseph, do you think these cultural boycotts launched by the West against Russia are a temporary and more of a symbolic act for the moment, or a tangible threat to Russia's cultural and geopolitical, perhaps geopolitical influence going forward?
Well, I think that in so much as these boycotts actually negate Russian soft power, then they do contribute to undermining Moscow's geopolitical standing. However, roughly half the world is not in tune with these developments. It's either ignoring them or it doesn't care either way. And I realize that, you have countries like India and other places that aren't supporting the sanctions, but they're also, sort of data colonies to some of these big Western companies that like YouTube and others, in so much as they're being affected by these cancellations and these boycotts. But, more importantly, if we put these boycotts into perspective, we can see, I think, 3 basic points. First, they're infantile and reactionary and perhaps demonstrate the cultural insecurity or vulnerability of whoever is imposing them. Second, canceling art and literature is akin to negating truth and beauty, which hurts everyone. And third, these cultural boycotts pale in comparison to the much more tangible threats to Russia's standing, namely the fact that many perceive it as having initiated an unnecessary war and committing war crimes. And likewise, the perceptions that Russia is not winning the war on the battlefield and is losing the conflict, not only militarily, but also economically, given heavy sanctions. And I think when we put it all into perspective, these boycotts are significant. They tell us something about the West, but I think that there are much bigger concerns facing Moscow presently.
All right, Neil Zhang, finally, how do you look at the relations between arts and politics? I mean, we all know that arts should be free of politics in a perfect world, but the reality is oftentimes art is a result of politics, like it or not. How do you think arts and politics should go about, complementing each other?
First, I think as for contemporary, lots of artists, they more and more actively trying to be part of the, political world, and especially in the States. And lots of our movement, contemporary art movement, shows that arts or contemporary can be a way of, engaging with, general public, with politics. So I think today the relationship between art and politics is very complicated. Some people say, art should be free from politics. It should be just a purely form. But some artists will definitely think that art is a way of engaging.
All right, Joseph, Neil Zhang, and Lee Kemp, thank you all very much for being part of today's discussion. We learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Wang Guan.
Thanks.
Great.
Appreciate it,
Thank
guys.
you, Wang
Thank
Guan.
you. While Russian artists have also been hit by the Western sanctions on Russia, they have not thrown in the towel. They're trying to find a new way forward. Now, let me conclude today's program with this report on the lives of Russian artists amid sanctions, reported by reporter Liu Jiaxin from Moscow.
This is a regular weekend show at the Moscow Musical Theater. It stages only Russian musicals. The gate was crowded at the weekend and the venue was packed. The audience was immersed in the performance, with occasional bursts of laughter.
Well, the show tonight is called Prime Time. It's a television story of how a girl becomes famous through a television show. And you know what's interesting is that I found a line of description here. It says, change a channel and rewrite your fate. Especially under such circumstances with all the sanctions sprang up suddenly, maybe it's time for some theaters to think about their new way forward.
My idea, we must have a success in Moscow. I don't want, I not dream about the world tour. And a Russian language have enough good market too, because there's more than 200 million people, and from entertainment market, it's not bad. For me, enough.
Mikhail Shvydkoy is the artistic director of the Moscow Musical Theater. He says it has not been seriously impacted by sanctions, even though the termination of multinational corporation Disney has had an effect. That's not the case for some artists, theaters, and film studios that have close international cooperation. The Cannes Film Festival and the Eurovision Song Contest both excluded Russian delegations this spring. Several well-known Russian artists have been suspended or even fired, including soprano Anna Netrebko, famous Russian conductor Valery Gergiev, and young pianist Alexander Malofeev.
I was very astonished because usually we said that the culture over than politics. But in the one moment, the one gesture, everything destroyed. In Western countries, if Russian artists want to keep contact, they must say something against Russia and against Russian president. And this was a condition of continuing his job.
Mr. Shvydkoy says the consequences of cultural sanctions are irreversible. However, he adds, now is a good time to get a new understanding of Russia's own arts. Liu Jiaxin, CGTN, Moscow.